Hey guys, welcome to Med School Made Easy. So this is the part 2 of the cranial nerves, which is the continuation of the previous video. So if you guys have not watched that part, you better go and watch that and come back to this. Okay, now moving on to the openings in the skull. So we have the olfactory nerve, which enters the skull through the cribriform plate. And then we have the optic nerve, which enters the skull through the optic canal. And then we have the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the ophthalmic and the abducens nerve, which exit the skull through the superior orbital fissure. And then we have the maxillary nerve, which is the second branch of the trigeminal nerve, which exits through the foramen rotundum. And then the mandibular nerve exits through the foramen ovale. And then the facial nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve exit through the internal acoustic meatus, and then the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the accessory nerve together leave the skull through the jugular foramen, and then the hypoglossal nerve leaves the skull through the hypoglossal canal. And now we will have a look at the pathway of the trigeminal nerve. So the sensory fibers from the spinal, sensory and the mesencephalic nuclei form a large single sensory nerve root, and then it joins the separately emerged motor root. And then together, these two pass below the tentorium cerebelli to the mouth of the trigeminal cave. And then it traversed the petrous bone and reached the middle cranial fossa. And then the sensory root expands into a large, flat, concentric trigeminal ganglion, while the motor root stays separate below the ganglion. And the anterior part of the ganglion beyond the subarachnoid space gives off its three sensory divisions, which are namely the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular nerves. And the ophthalmic and the maxillary divisions pass forward in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. And the mandibular nerve passes straight down from the lower part of the ganglion to the foramen ovale. And the motor root also passes through the foramen ovale and joins the mandibular division just outside the skull to form the mixed mandibular nerve. So now we will have a look at the three branches of the trigeminal nerve in detail. So we have the ophthalmic division first. So it has three main branches, which are namely the frontal, the nasociliary, and the lacrimal branches. So the frontal branch gives off the supratrochlear nerve, which innervates the upper eyelid, the conjunctiva, and the lower part of the forehead. And then we have the supraorbital nerve, which innervates the frontal air sinus, the upper eyelid, the forehead, and the scalp till vertex. And then the nasociliary branch gives off the posterior ethmoidal nerve, which innervates the sphenoidal air sinus and the posterior ethmoidal air sinus. And then the long ciliary nerve supplies the sensory nerves to the eyeball, and then there's a branch to the ciliary ganglion and infratrochlear nerve and an anterior ethmoidal branch as well. And then we have the lacrimal branch, which supplies the lateral part of the eyelid and provides secretomotor fibers to the lacrimal gland. And then the maxillary division, so it gives off the meningeal branch in the middle cranial fossa, and then in the pterygopalatine fossa it gives off the ganglionic branches, the zygomatic, the posterior and the superior alveolar branches. And then in the infraorbital canal it gives off the middle superior alveolar and the anterior superior alveolar branches. And then the mandibular division, so the trunk of the nerve gives off the meningeal and the nerve to the medial pterygoid muscles, and then the anterior division gives off the deep temporal, the lateral pterygoid, the masseteric and the buccal branches. And then the posterior division gives off the auriculotemporal and the lingual branches, as well as the inferior alveolar nerve. So now we will have a look at the facial nerve pathway. So the main facial nerve emerges at the lower border of the pons above the olive, and then the nervus intermedius emerges between the pons and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And these two nerves together pass laterally in the cerebellopontine angle through the pontine cistern with the eighth nerve, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. And then they enter the internal acoustic meatus, and the whole facial nerve passes into the anterosuperior quadrant of the fundus of the meatus. And near the middle ear, the nerve makes a sharp posterior bend to form the geniculate ganglion. And from here, the nerve runs back into the medial wall of the middle ear above the promontory. And from behind the middle ear, the nerve runs vertically downwards through the facial canal. And after shedding all the nervous intermedius fibers, the nerve emerges from the styloid-mastoid foramen as a purely motor nerve. And it passes into the parotid gland to give off its terminal branches. So now we will have a look at the branches of the facial nerve. So within the facial canal, it gives off the greater petrosal nerve, the nerve to stapedius and the chorda tympani branches. And then as it exits through the stylomastoid foramen, it gives off posterior auricular and nerve to the digastric muscle and the styloid branches. And then the terminal branches within the parotid gland are the temporal, the zygomatic, the buccal, the marginal mandibular and the cervical branches. And then there are some communicating branches which communicate with the adjacent cranial and the spinal nerves. So thank you for watching, and I hope you guys found this video useful. So don't forget to subscribe and turn on the post notifications on so you can get notified